If you would, I want us to turn now to what Habakkuk saw, what Habakkuk says. And I want us to look at the rest of our text for this evening. It is Habakkuk 1, verses 2 through 4. And I want you to listen to what Habakkuk says as he cries out to God. Notice what he says, O Lord, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear me? Even cry out to you violence, and you will not save. Why do you show me iniquity, and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are before me. There is strife and contention arises. Therefore the law is powerless, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore perverse judgment proceeds. Habakkuk cries out to God. You know, this first verse talks about Habakkuk cries out to God and says, God, how long shall I cry? We already mentioned earlier, this gives us a little bit of detail about who Habakkuk was. He calls God not just God, but he calls him Lord in English translations. And as most of us know, that English translation is all capitalized. He uses God's covenantal name. He cries out to Yahweh. He says, Oh Yahweh, how long shall I cry? He says, how long do I have to keep crying? How long do I have to keep calling you? You know, as I thought about this and I considered what Habakkuk's doing here, I remember a commercial from a few years back. Matter of fact, there's quite a few commercials. You may have remembered them yourself. From the company Verizon, cell phone company, and they had a commercial they often had with a man walking around with a cell phone. And he constantly asked the question, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Good. He'd move. Can you hear me now? It almost seems like Habakkuk is crying out to God that way. He almost seems like Habakkuk is crying out to God, can you hear me now? What about now? Do you hear me now, God? What about now? And it seems like Habakkuk tries to move and tries to find a way to God to hear him. But he says God hasn't answered him the way he would like for him to answer him. He asks God, have you not heard my cries? What a terrible thought. What a terrible feeling Habakkuk must have felt here. To think that God didn't hear his cry. To think that God didn't hear his prayers. Habakkuk says, have you not heard me, God? Have you not heard me cry out for help? He says, not did I cry out to you. He said, I cried out violence. I cried out for you to see what is happening. He said, God, you didn't act. You didn't respond in the way. You haven't responded in the way that he would like. He calls out, God, have you heard me? Why do you not act when I cry out violence? Why do you not cry out in a way that you act, that you correct the violence, the wickedness that is in this world? First Habakkuk cries out, why, God? Don't you hear me? Don't you see what's going on? Then Habakkuk goes on and Habakkuk says, don't you see what's happening? He asks God, do you not see what they are doing? You know, he says, why do you, talking to God, show me, talking about Habakkuk, iniquity? He says, why do you show me sin? Why do I see this? Why do I see what the people are doing? Habakkuk says it breaks his heart. You know, when I read this and I thought about what Habakkuk said, I remember a verse from 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 7 and 8, a passage that's very interesting. A passage that talks about someone who was in a very similar state, very similar situation that Habakkuk was in, 2 Peter chapter 2. When Peter there writes about Lot, or he writes about Sodom and Gomorrah, about how God didn't spare judgment, how God brought judgment upon them, but he mentions that he saved Lot. And he says that he saved Lot because Lot was a righteous man. You know, it's interesting. We don't think about Lot as being that righteous man. We think about there must be something wrong with Lot for him to live in Sodom and Gomorrah. But we find out that Peter gives us some information. He tells us something about Lot that fits very well with what's happening in Habakkuk. You look at 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. And it says, and delivered, talking about God, and he delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. For that righteous man dwelling among them tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. We see here Peter says that Lot's soul was tormented. Lot's soul was in such distress Because not only did he see their deeds, he heard about what they had done. We see that Lot knew what was happening in Sodom and Gomorrah. It says it tormented him. And I think when we look at Habakkuk, we see that Habakkuk feels the same way. Habakkuk is heartbroken. He's torn because he doesn't think God's acting. He doesn't think God sees. He doesn't think God realizes what is going on in his world. And we see he cries out, God, how long or why do you show me iniquity? Why do you cause me to see trouble? Why, God? Why does this happen? And he asks God, he says, for plunders and violence are before me. He says, their strife and contention arises. He says all these things. He says there's plundering, there's violence, there's strife, there's contention. The idea there's not, I don't believe that the idea here is talking about an outside nation. This is talking about Israel itself. He says these brothers are doing it to themselves. God's people is reacting and acting in such a way that they are tearing themselves apart. He says, God, do you not see it? Why will you not act, God? Why isn't God taking a step to correct this bad behavior, this evil, wicked behavior? Then we notice verse 4, the last verse we're going to talk about today. And he asks a question again of how long is God going to wait? How long, God, until you act? Notice what he says. He says, therefore, because of how people are treating each other, he says, therefore, the law is powerless. You thought about that? Imagine the situation you have to be in. Imagine how bad things have to be that you see the law as being powerless, as ineffective. Now, whether Habakkuk is talking about God's spiritual law, or if he's talking about a national law, the civil laws, we're not exactly sure. But he says the law is powerless. Why does he say the law is powerless? He goes on to say, not only is the law powerless, he says, but justice never goes forth. Justice never comes to those who need it. Justice never arises to those who have its need. He says that justice isn't doing its part. That justice is not becoming. It is not acting in a way that it should. When I think about this idea, he says that law and justice aren't working. It almost seems as if in a way Habakkuk's asking if God is working. Because when we think about God, especially in the Old Testament, we see God as a God of the law, but also God as a God of justice. He is a just God. And Habakkuk says the law is powerless. He says justice doesn't do his part. And notice what he goes on to say. He says, for the wicked surround the righteous. The idea of surrounding there almost seems to be that they are outnumbering them. That the wicked outnumber the righteous. They're more powerful. They're mistreating them. And he cries out all the more to God. This is the reason for his cry to God. Because they are mistreating those around them. Then you notice he goes on at the end of this verse to finish his thought they made in the first half of this verse. He says, justice never goes forth. He says, but perverted judgment proceeds. He says, perverted justice, or perverted judgment. Justice isn't doing its part. He says, but perverted justice, perverted judgment is coming. He says, how long, O Lord? You know, this is the first of two cries by Habakkuk. Habakkuk cries out to God here, how long, God, till you act? How long till you take the steps to rectify this situation? Now, when we get here to the end of this section, I don't want us to leave on a bad part, on a bad note, but I do want us to notice the next verse real quickly. Verse 5. We see that God answers Habakkuk. God says, look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astonished. He says, for I will work a work in your days which you would not believe though you were told it. God says, Habakkuk, I'm acting. God tells Habakkuk, I am doing something. I see what's happening. I'm about to rectify that situation. God says, I'm acting. Just wait, Habakkuk. Just wait to see what's coming. And go on to chapter 2, verse 4, we see the rest of God, another part of God answers. We see that God answers, that God responds to Habakkuk here. And we see Habakkuk's response to God, that he talks about what has happened. Notice what Habakkuk says. He says, behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him. He says, but the just shall live by his faith. Habakkuk tells us that's the individual's responsibility to remain faithful. Notice what he said there. But the just shall live by his faith. You know, I want us to ask ourselves a question as we close this lesson. As we close this introductory sermon about the book of Habakkuk, do we ever feel that God's not answering us? Do we ever feel that God's not listening when we pray? God said he's listening, and God said he will answer. He is acting in our world. We just not on our time, but on his. And secondly, we ask ourselves the question, are we living by faith? Is our faith strong enough? Is our faith in God so firm, so secure, that we know God will act, and God will bring about his end, and it will work to the benefit, it will work to the joy of those who are faithful to him. Tonight, when we face hard troubles, is our faith maintaining us with God? Thank you.